Ελάτε, κυρία Διαμαντοπούλου. Welcome to the annual Athens Democracy Forum. When leaders fail to lead, the people will lead and make them follow.
Perhaps George Orwell made only one mistake. He perhaps should have entitled his book 2024 instead of 1984.
Democracy under challenge is our subject. Well, that is good. Democracies need to be challenged.
Democracy is very, very fragile. It's like a delicate flower that needs unique conditions to survive.
We have to constantly fight to defend those very essential rights. Without that kind of protection, human society can be really evil.
The Athens Democracy Forum is very important because at a time when democracy is threatened in so many places around the world, going back to the birthplace is a way to concentrate the minds of people from many walks of life.
10 years ago, if I questioned what the president is doing, I would die in jail. The syndrome of big man is under siege.
I think that globalism is the last of the great failed ideologies of the 20th century.
To be against globalism, it means that. It means America as a fortress losing any sort of credibility.
It is the press that is the foremost institution within our societies charged with determining what information is truly within the public interest to know.
Gaddafi literally sat there and told me that his people still loved him and just acting as if he really wasn't connected to reality.
My only dream, and everyone's dream, was actually to leave Syria, to get away from this big prison without walls.
I am a woman, I'm Iranian, I'm a mother, and I happen to be a Muslim.
For me, the threat greater even than climate change, greater even than any pandemic, is the feeling of powerlessness.
This call to action is not for one or two of us, but all of us.
So join all of us that have already supported the Athens Democracy Forum and our foundation. Help us empower society through citizen engagement and better governance so democracy can evolve.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the Democracy and Culture Foundation, Mr. Achilles Chaltas.
President von der Leyen, Secretary General Ban, Mayor Bakoyannis, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Καλησπέρα σας και καλώς ορίσατε σε αυτόν τον ναό πολιτισμού και δημοκρατίας. Welcome to this temple of democracy and culture. It has really been my privilege for the past 10 years to welcome you at the Athens Democracy Forum, a gathering among these hallowed columns of the city, where rule by the people was first tried. The forum was hosted then by the International Herald Tribune, which subsequently became the International New York Times. And I'm happy to say that the partnership is continuing very strongly, and it's now organized, even the bell approves, and now organized by the Democracy and Culture Foundation. A free press remains a critical pillar of democracy. And democracy, as well as the free press, needs help. Since we first gathered here 10 years ago, democracy and the press have been battered by the malign forces of authoritarianism, fake news, tribalism, bitter economic and political divisions and disease. And now the once unimaginable has descended on us, an all-out war in Europe. Vladimir Putin's cruel and destructive invasion of Ukraine on a set of concocted pretexts is something I confess we could not have imagined when we first met here. the war has spread far beyond its borders, and many of us, and democracy as well, will be shivering this winter as a result. Does that mean that this forum has been gathering in vain? That democracy is failing? I don't believe so. Democracy is really not an isolated fortress that, once breached, falls to a mob. Being here, it is an idea, a way of life, a faith that requires constant renewal and struggle. The Democracy and Culture Foundation is here to help democracy evolve. Just in the same way, Madam President, I believe that the EU's Conference for the Future of Europe does, and we are honoured to have President von der Leyen with us today, and we look forward to hearing your vision on our shared goals for democracy. Our ultimate, and I believe mutual, goal is better governance, and our basic belief is that you cannot have good governance without citizen engagement. Hence our focus on deliberative democracy in a way that it addresses the distrust of citizens, but at the same time instructs governments on the merits of participatory tools. So by listening to what our speakers tell us every year, our foundation, just 2 years old now, embarked on a series of roundtables this year. In Sydney with New Democracy Foundation, Seoul with Taipei Academy, Washington with Bertelsmann Foundation, Berlin with Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Tel Aviv with IDEA and Sapienship, and ended up in London with EBRD, where we synthesized the results, the outcomes. And yesterday, all these 6 cities came here to Athens and presented some of the practical reforms we need to support. Let me mention just 2 of them. Perhaps we should be establishing a 4th branch of government, composed of ordinary citizens selected by sortition. We are at the ancient agora, after all. Perhaps upper houses becoming citizens' chambers. A second one is citizens' assembly to design a process defining and labeling disinformation across search engines and social media. Our chief diplomatic correspondent, Stephen Erlanger, will moderate a panel on rethinking media after President von der Leyen's keynote. But these are just 2 very practical policy recommendations that our Building Blocks of Democracy project has come up with, and there's more as we strive to stay true to the do part of our strategic impact chain at the Foundation, which is think, talk, and do. We need to do things, not just talk, and all or part of this requires maybe even constitutional change, which is bold and ambitious, I know, but essential if the evolution and perhaps revolution of democracy is taken seriously. That really is our task here at the Athens Democracy Forum. We know what's wrong. What we need to do is tighten our togas and come up with real, actionable ideas for the future. In a way, we are advocating a return to Athenian democracy, a modern agora, if you like, and by mastering technology to be our ally, we can be even more successful than the ancient Greeks. I would like to thank all our speakers this evening, but also over the 5 days of this forum. I mean, how this forum has grown from the 2 hours that we were here 10 years ago is unbelievable. I would also like to thank our headline sponsors, Meta and Taipei Academy, our gold sponsors, Luminate and Microsoft, and so many others like the Gruen Institute, EBRD, the Council of Europe, and many more that you see on the screens. And we are delighted that we have just been awarded a grant by the EU Horizons Orbis project to put some of our projects into action. Gosh, there are so many people I really need to thank, and I can't do it. But I just want to highlight some of them. Olga Kefalogianni, you're the person that opened the ancient agora to us. Mayor Kaminis, you came to New York 2 times to save this conference and keep it here in Athens. Alexis Papachelas and Nikos Kostandaras, you came up with the name Democracy Under Pressure. Simeon Tsomokos, you opened so many doors. Alberto Cano, you did so much. Roger Cohen and the entire New York Times team have been behind this for 10 years and even now as an independent entity. So many people to thank. But Mayor Bakoyannis, you are the current custodian of this wonderful city, and you and the city of Athens remain faithful stakeholders of this endeavor, as do the United Nations Democracy Fund, enabled by Kofi Annan, whose foundation is with us today and a stakeholder, and we have a message from Nada Al-Nashif, the United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is Athenian democracy, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to regalvanize, and that is what this forum's heart beats to. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and we will hear now from Nada Al-Nashif.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to join this event. Since its inception in 2012, the Forum has become a major venue to reflect on the challenges facing democratic values worldwide. In these complex times, such discussions on how to preserve democratic gains and pursue the enjoyment of human rights for all are even more critical. 10 years after the initial Athens Democracy Forum was convened, a glance through the state of the world today reveals a grim picture. Just as we thought we were slowly emerging from a global health pandemic, the war in Ukraine, with its tragic human suffering and global socioeconomic repercussions, reminds us once again how fragile progress in human rights protection, peace, and development can be. The pandemic has shown us the consequences of long-standing gaps in human rights protection, discrimination, and inequalities, and their disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable. It has also compounded political, social, and economic crises, undermining years of progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and compromising economic, social, and cultural rights, from health and food to housing, water and sanitation, education, and decent work. The global food, fuel, and financial crises are threatening to plunge millions in poverty. According to the World Bank, between 75 and 95 million additional people could be living in extreme poverty in 2022 compared to pre-COVID-19 projections. While governments around the world have adopted unprecedented and often necessary measures to respond to the pandemic, they have sometimes gone beyond what is necessary and proportionate to safeguard public health. Space for civic action has been shrinking, with repression of peaceful assembly and of expression and threats to dissenting voices, including in the digital space. Polarization, both within and between countries, also continues to grow, undermining global solidarity, weakening multilateralism and the international legal order, with devastating consequences for human rights protection. Democratic gains of the last 30 years have been greatly eroded. In 2021, the level of democracy enjoyed globally by the average person was down to 1989 levels. Last year, almost a third of the global population lived under authoritarian rule, and the number of countries leaning to authoritarianism is 3 times that of those leaning to democracy, a trend common to all regions. In this context, our office has repeatedly called on all states to protect civil and political rights, including the rights to peaceful assembly, essential to a functioning democracy. You will deliberate what went wrong over the next few days and examine how we got here. Allow me to suggest a few contributing factors. First, I believe that growing discrimination against women, minorities, older persons, and others historically marginalized, and the inequalities deriving from structural discrimination have widened the gap between people and institutions, threatening the foundations of any democratic system. Second, the curtailment of public participation and lack of transparency in public decision-making, with diminished accountability of government officials, has also led to entrenched political disenchantment, with negative implications for people's effective engagement. Third, decreasing trust in institutions has provided fertile ground for populism, with political leaders using the current political, economic, and security volatility as an excuse to impose restrictions on political freedoms. Collectively, we should strive to reverse the worrying trend of shrinking civic space and to rebuild trust in institutions by strengthening inclusive public dialogue and equal participation. Democratic institutions themselves need to be strengthened, whether electoral commissions or high courts, local government structures, national human rights institutions, and anti-corruption entities, including by increasing their independence and transparency. In his flagship report, Our Common Agenda, the Secretary-General sets out a powerful vision for the role of multilateral governance in tackling contemporary challenges. The agenda begins with a call for a renewed social contract anchored in human rights to fight inequalities and exclusion, promote social justice, and preserve the space for the full exercise of civil and political rights. I am convinced that the program of the Forum, with the rich expertise of the participants and this uniquely inspiring setting, will ensure fruitful interactions. Good luck with your discussions.
The City of Athens, ladies and gentlemen, is the other stakeholder of the Athens Democracy Forum, so it gives me pleasure to invite Mayor Kostas Bakoyannis of Athens.
Madam President, it's a true privilege to welcome you to Athens. I know that I'm expressing all Athenians when I thank you for your leadership, especially at this critical time. Mr. Secretary General, your historical journey is one of inspiration. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the Athens Democracy Forum is marking its 10th anniversary this year. But as Achilleas observed a few days ago, while the Forum can celebrate, democracy cannot. Indeed, the dark forces of authoritarianism and division have struck at the heart of our continent with an unlawful invasion. We owe our moral and our practical support to all brave Ukrainians, men and women, young and old, who defy, resist, and heroically stand against barbarism on the front line. In this spirit, I'm proud to report the City of Athens last night bestowed the Athens Democracy Award to President Zelensky as a symbol of Ukrainian heroism. At the same time, however, we owe ourselves to commit to the home front. This is, after all, unfortunately, shaping up to be the winter of our discontent. And all predictions are sobering. High energy prices, triggered by supply disruptions, could result in a long, cold, unjust, and expensive winter for millions of people around the globe and in Europe, as energy poverty reaches unprecedented levels. Now, this is a time for European solidarity. It is, after all, a European problem that requires a European solution. And as we watch from afar, white smoke seems to be appearing in the skies of Brussels. The proposed windfall levy applied to surplus profits is clearly a step in the right direction. And we still hold hope that the calls of 15 countries, our own Greece amongst them, will not be defied, and that legislation for a price cap on gas imports will be proposed, or alternatively, that another path leading to a similar result will be chosen, and we will move forward with common purchases. In any case, I think we can all agree that this, ladies and gentlemen, is not the time for bidding wars or fruitless competitions, but for cooperation and partnership. Now, of course, truth is that for this year, much that could have been done quickly, has been done, from installing LNG terminals to reanimating old plants. But we must be frank. This is not a one-winter problem. We will get through this crisis. We will get through this winter. But we must prepare for the next one. There is no back to normal. And we have a long and a hard road ahead in tackling the energy crisis in Europe. It is a climate crisis, but it is also a national security crisis, a challenge to our sovereignty. And in response, we need to, as the cliché goes, think global, act local, or in our case, think European and act local. And I dare say, without hopefully sounding too self-serving, that the role of cities and local authorities is rather critical. Let's not forget that urban centers are actually responsible for 70% of CO2 emissions. Now, there is good news. There's good news. Cities like Athens have already led by example and put our money where our mouth is. Our targets are much more ambitious than national efforts. But there is also bad news. We have lost precious time and have counted on cheap energy from Russia to facilitate our green transition. We could have been more proactive in the past. So we need to act now in two directions. On the one hand, end energy dependence, and on the other, green transition. So at the same time, we want to accelerate renewables deployment and, yes, save energy. But a quick note, if I may, this cannot be accomplished with us issuing edicts. It has not worked in the past, and it will not work now. Rather than waving our finger, we should be giving our hand. No matter what we do, the most important thing is to take the people with us. This is, after all, a time of unity, of transcending parties, ideologies, and egos. And we need synergies between all levels of government to foster implementation rather than brave new commitments. So top-down, we need coordination, we need financing tools, including, I should say, direct financing for cities, especially for those colleagues of mine who are not as fortunate as I am in Athens, colleagues who are held hostage by illiberal national governments. And here I'm thinking, for example, of my friends in Budapest or Warsaw, but also bottom-up, self-reliance and self-sufficiency. And one more thing, since COP27 is around the corner, this cannot be an excuse or an alibi for backtracking when it comes to our climate targets. Ladies and gentlemen, it may surprise you that I spoke about the energy crisis in a democracy forum. But you know what? It was a conscious choice. It's not only that in defending our home from Putin's weaponization of energy, we are defending for democratic values. It runs much deeper than that. Many of us mayors around Europe are working towards fair and inclusive cities, cities that support the most vulnerable amongst us and leave no one behind. It's an ambitious, admittedly, but worthwhile goal. And unsustainable energy and living costs are quite literally mines in the road ahead, mines that can blow up our efforts. Now, in full disclosure, we are no strangers to energy poverty in urban centers, and the pandemic has worsened inequalities, but not on this scale, never on this scale. Today, we are at serious risk of exacerbating poverty and inequality by limiting access to the most vulnerable to lighting, cooling, refrigeration, clean cooking, and heating. Families should not have to choose between food and paying for their energy bills. Democracy is on the line. And I'm reminded of Yeats, who proclaimed in another dramatic European era that the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The battles between democracy and autocracy wages beyond, but also within our borders. The apologists of authoritarianism speak with no shame, forgetting that in its worst day, democracy is much better than the best day of the dystopias they defend. It is the very beauty, the absolute majesty of democracy, that it gives time and it gives space even to those who threaten it, endanger it, or wish to overthrow it. Look at the re-election results in France, in Sweden, hard-won battles. And did I mention Italy? And Italy? And Italy? We cannot afford to lose any more precious time. If not now, then when? Many thanks, and once again, welcome to Athens.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and indeed, let's act now. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the point for this year's the Aristotle Address. As Aristotle probably thought, in times of crises, you need wisdom, you need virtue. With these two words in context, Madam President, I invite you to give us the Aristotle Address on the 10th anniversary of Athens Democracy Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the European Commission.
Thank you very much, President Tsaltas. It is such a great pleasure to be back in Athens, the most ancient capital of Europe and one of the most breathtaking cities that we have in Europe. Former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Mayor Bakoyannis, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to celebrate with you the 10th anniversary of the Athens Democracy Forum. This week also marks another anniversary. 25 centuries ago, one of the most powerful fleets in human history appeared in the waters right in front of Athens and Greek cities. A foreign empire was attacking the free cities in Greece. But it was in the Strait of Salamis. The Greek alliance achieved an unlikely victory against a much stronger enemy. Historians and poets describe that war in very clear terms. For the first time in history, autocracy attacked democracy. And autocracy failed while democracy prevailed. In the words of Aeschylus, the Greeks tore the yoke apart because they were slaves to no lord. Unlike their foes, the Greeks were fighting not for the greed of a single man, but for their own freedom. Today, once again, a democracy fights for its own survival against the aggression of a foreign autocrat. Russia's attack against Ukraine is yet another battle in a war that has been raging for 25 centuries. The war of autocracy against democracy, and I'm deeply convinced that democracy will prevail. But it is also sobering to see that the tragedies of the past keep repeating themselves, and that too many in Europe have underestimated the threats both outside and inside our borders. Here in Europe, we saw democracy spread across the continent, decade after decade, wave after wave. When Greece, Spain, and Portugal freed themselves from authoritarian rule, when the Iron Curtain came down and the wind of change blew across Europe. And then, in 2003, when in this very hall, our union welcomed 10 new members to the family. For more than 70 years, our continent has marched incessantly towards democracy. And many of us started to believe that Europe and all humanity would keep advancing naturally towards freedom and peaceful cooperation. We started to take democracy for granted. Today, we realize that history does not always move in a straight line. There are setbacks and comebacks, and it is every generation's task to fight for democracy. It is our generational task to help Ukrainians that they fight for their right to determine their own future. It is our task to protect the democracies from Russian blackmail and from the interference of autocracies. And it is our task to help strengthen all democracies within Europe. The values that inspired the founders of Athenian democracy should still guide us today. The idea that power belongs to the citizens. The idea that we are all equal before the law. The idea that free speech is a fundamental right. This is the immortal gift that Greece has given to the world. Yet, ancient democracy was far from perfect or complete. Only free men could walk the road that led from this place, the Agora, to the Pnika, where the assemblies took place. Women like me were not allowed to speak their mind and cast their vote. The Pnika is only 1 kilometer away from here, and yet it took thousands of years before women finally reach it and vote. And obstacles still stand in women's way towards full equality. Today we know that democracy does not end at the ballot box. Democracy also means equal pay for equal work. Democracy also means equal responsibilities and equal rights when it comes to care and career. Democracy means equal access to power, be it in politics or in business. Voting rights for women were not the finish line, but just the new beginning towards a perfect democracy. And this is the essence of democracy. It's always open to change. It always seeks new horizons. There's one concept from Aristotle that fits perfectly to democracy. It's the idea of dynamis, of potentiality. Democracy is ever-changing. It is a promise that must constantly be fulfilled. And that is what makes it stand out from autocracy. Democracy may be not perfect, but it is perfectible. So take Ukraine. When we granted Ukraine the status of candidate to joining our union, some objected that Ukrainians' democracy may still be too young. But since the Maidan protest of 2014, Ukraine's democracy has grown so much. In a few years, it has reformed more than in previous decades. It has set up anti-corruption institutions. It has adopted first laws to break the oligarchs' grip on Ukraine's economic, political, and public life. Its civil society has conquered new space and holds the government to account. And the country's institutions are now passing the ultimate stress test of war. Most of this progress has been achieved because the people of Ukraine have Europe in their hearts and in their minds. And the same is true for our friends in Albania, in North Macedonia, and across the Western Balkans. It is true for Moldova and Georgia, who have also asked to join our union. Once again, the wind of change is blowing across our continent. Ladies and gentlemen, all democracies are constant work in progress, including inside our union. The European Union was built on the promise, unity in diversity. But this promise has yet to be achieved in full. The path towards full equality for all citizens is still long. Racism and anti-Semitism have not disappeared. And in parts of our union, minorities are not always respected. LGBTIQ rights continue to be violated. The rule of law and the independence of the judiciary are still challenged. We have seen judges stripped of their immunity and driven out of office without justification. And serious concerns have been raised on corruption. These developments are against our values, against our treaties, and against our democracy. And as guardian of the treaty, it is the Commission's obligation to act. It is up to us to continue the work of our founders. And we have come such a long way. We are a union of 500 million people, 27 countries, more than 24 different languages, countless ethnicities and culture, but one European soul. On policies, there might be disagreements, and at times very severe disagreements, but the overwhelming majority of us believes that Europe is our destiny. Today, I would like to speak about 4 priorities we must focus on. The first of all is the new threats. Warships and soldiers are no longer the only weapons in the hands of foreign autocrats. They craft disinformation. They finance fake research institutes to poison our public debates with their lies. They meddle in our elections with cash and with cyber attacks. This is also part of their war against democracy. And we must protect ourselves. This is why I have announced a new Defense of Democracy package. We introduced legislation to screen foreign direct investment in our companies for security concerns. If we do that for our economy, shouldn't we do the same for our values? We need to better shield ourselves from malign interference. My second point are the multiple crises. Our citizens demand something very straightforward from us, that we make our democracies deliver on the great crises of our time. The pandemic was such a crisis. And I still remember those who were saying that autocracies are better equipped to deliver results, and those who were asking to purchase Russian and Chinese vaccine. This was just a few months ago. Today, these voices have become quiet. We bought vaccines together so that all European countries, big or small, low or high debts, all would receive their doses at the same time, at the same price. And it is no coincidence that this new generation of life-saving vaccines was developed in democracies where freedom of science and freedom to excel count. We reacted at the speed of light to Russia's attack against Ukraine with the largest sanctions package ever, with 19 billion of financial support, with military equipment, hosting more than 8 million refugees. So democracies can deliver if we are united. We are able to find answers that are more powerful than just the sum of 27 countries. My third point is on new frontiers. Putin's attack against Ukraine is an attempt to reverse the course of history and to stop the long journey of democracy. But this isn't only about Russia's atrocious war. The number of democracies, as has been said, in the world reached an all-time high in 2012, but it has fallen since then. Military coups have struck from Mali to Myanmar. In Afghanistan, democracy has lost after decades of war. Millions of people across the world are now fighting for their freedom. We see it in Iran, where brave women rise up and demand equality and respect for their rights. We see it in Hong Kong, where journalists and labor right advocates take to the streets, even though they are threatened with prison. The democratic values that were born here in Greece have spread across continents and oceans because all people aspire to freedom, even and especially in countries where democracy has not flourished yet. There can be no doubt. The desire to determine the course of your life and be the master of your own future burns in every human soul. And I want our union to stand at the side of every country that longs for freedom and every young democracy that strives for more in Europe and beyond. This means, first and foremost, to support Ukraine with economic, political, and military means, but there is more. Autocracies are using more subtle means to curtail the sovereignty of other nations. Chinese investment, for instance, is pushing several low-income countries on the brink of default. And Russian gas and oil always comes at the expense of national sovereignty and independence. This is where Global Gateway comes into play. Global Gateway is our new European program to address the global investment gaps for infrastructure, from energy systems to digitalization. Global Gateway is driven by democratic values. We offer investments that are sustainable for countries' finances and respect its sovereignty. We offer digital investments that protect individual rights in a digital world. Investments that advance the rights of workers and local communities. It is a way of promoting our democratic values at all corners of the world. And finally, let us never forget that our democracies belong to future generations. For too long, humanity has behaved like there was no tomorrow. Instead of preserving and nurturing the world around us, we devoured it piece by piece at the expense of future generations. Climate change is the colossal burden we are slamming on our children's future. If we want young people to have faith in our democracies, we must finally put young people at the heart of everything we do. And this is why I have proposed to enshrine solidarity between generations in the fundamental treaties of the European Union. Every action that our union takes should be inspired by a simple principle: that we should do no harm to our children's future. And we should have the world a better place for the next generation. This is the essence in the long journey of democracy. It is about restoring confidence in our future, and not only announcing with words to new generations that tomorrow will be better than today, but proving it by deeds. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy is a promise. It is the promise that people can be masters of their own future, that we can determine the course of our countries and change course when necessary. This is the greatest strength of democracy, what makes it more just and more successful than any other form of government. Autocracies always look backwards. They are systems built so that the powerful can cling on to power, and so that people are stuck in a never-ending past. When I look at the challenges of today, Russia's war in Ukraine, the blackmail through energy, the pressures of our way of life, then I know that we are all being tested today, whether we defend democracy, whether we are steadfast, united, and determined. Each and every one of us is part of our resilience. It's up to us to protect our future. It is up to us to make democracy prevail. It is up to us to stand in unity. And therefore, long live Europe, and many thanks for your attention.
May I, on behalf of the whole forum, Madam President, thank you for your time and your address. You don't have to stay, but I did want to express our collective thanks for a soaring speech, an inspiring speech, and a speech full of challenge. So thank you very, very much, and fortitude to you. Okay. Danke sehr. While the President makes her way, could I ask my panel to come up?
Government censorship is contradictory to a healthy democracy. Digital governance and media literacy are the keys to supporting quality journalism in the era of post-truth politics. So what should democracies do? Taiwan provides a great example of incorporating the tech community in the information warfare. Not only does their government collaborate with civic technologists to develop open governance, but they also help to monitor trends of disinformation and inject mythbusters from independent news sources right before this information spreads widely. The open source community has played a prominent role in filling the information vacuum and foster meaningful public discussion. Moreover, in aid of developing public media literacy with a digital inclusive governance, it's possible to support quality journalism for a healthy democracy.
The democracy of the internet has led to widespread misunderstanding about what independent media truly is. We've garbled the category to now include anybody who presents an anti-establishment news narrative. The algorithm used by social media sites then multiplies this effect, creating online echo chambers for users. Here's an example. In my online feed, I never get shown conspiracy theories from Alex Jones or Breitbart, and this is because my algorithm understands that I'm not interested in that type of content. But that doesn't mean I'm in the clear. As a left-leaning consumer, I very rarely, if ever, get shown right-leaning news, even from reputable sources. Once in a while, I even get shown left-leaning disinformation. If this is my feed, then what do the feeds of less discerning consumers look like? It's not enough to simply flag disinformation, as was done during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic or the 2020 US election. The algorithm must be eliminated or regulated so that consumers have a chance to hear other sides of the story, providing a fuller picture that will hopefully lead toward the truth.
I think we have some fans back there. That's great. In this lovely place, we're here to talk about truthsayers and naysayers. And I have to say, if I'm allowed, as a professional journalist, I'm sorry the president didn't stay for some questions and a bit of exchange with us, but she apparently had to go. Instead, we have a very good panel with us to discuss these key issues. And just as a bit of an introduction, I keep thinking of a famous phrase of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who some of you may remember was a senator from New York and a historian and a wonderful writer, who said, "You may be entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. That facts are not personal. Facts are objective, ideally." And the other thing I think of is in a discussion with a French minister, he was talking a bit about the impact social media has had on democracy. And he said the problem is democracy depends on the distinction between truth and lies. Now, once I did an Oxford Union debate with Ben Smith, then of BuzzFeed, on the topic of was social media good for journalism or bad for journalism? And it was really interesting. I had to argue that it was bad for journalism. I wasn't sure I was right, but I'm not sure that I'm wrong either. So this is part of what we're going to discuss here tonight. So what we have is just going from that direction to this, Stephen King, who's the CEO of Illuminate, Donald Martin, who's the former editor of the Herald in Scotland, a media consultant, Khadija Patel, who brings her South African experience to run the International Press Institute, which is quite important. And next to me, Anna Romandash, a journalist from Ukraine. So, Steve, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you. And like you, Stephen, I'd love to have had the president to listen to this panel, because I think the role that the European Union can play in the future of free and independent media is a really important one. And I'll come back to some specific actions I think that I'd like to see them take on. But I think a number of commentators have said already this evening that there is an increasing rollback of democracy. The University of Gothenburg had said that now 70% of the world's population is living under autocracy. That's up from 50% only 10 years ago. And so I think there is countervailing process that we're all involved in to try and protect and support democracy, and a free and independent media is part of that. We, as Illuminate, a global philanthropic foundation, did some research in Latin America earlier this year amongst young people in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And the picture was really interesting. They'd emerged from political protests, from the environment movement, from feminism, from LGBTQI rights. And their view of politics and democracy was very different from their older population. They had very little faith in the institutions of democracy, of political parties. They felt that they weren't representing their particular views. And where they were getting their information from was also very different from older generations. There is a blurring between news and politics and entertainment, which is driven by social media companies, which are now starting to dictate the way in which people consume information. In Colombia earlier this year, we saw the emergence of the first TikTok candidate, Rodolfo Fernandez, who came from nowhere to suddenly be the opponent to President Petro. The emergence of TikTok as a channel for campaigning is something which I think shows a new reality in the way in which media is developing and is evolving. And that's not new. Media from newspapers to radio to TV to online has constantly evolved, and is also will constantly evolve in the future. I think what has changed in the last 10 years is the role of the social media companies. And we've heard again from others earlier today and from the President herself that this can have a very distorting effect on democratic discourse. It can drive polarization. It can develop echo chambers, which we have to be very conscious of in terms of how people consume and get their information. And my concern here is that the business model, the surveillance advertising business model, is driving this. And we've seen this not only in technical terms, but also in very human terms as well. In the UK, where I live, a tragic case of Molly Russell, a 14-year-old girl who took her own life because she was fed constant and further extreme versions of suicide notes on Instagram. And the social media companies are not owning up to this, they're not paying attention to this, and they're trying to escape responsibility. Frances Haugen, the whistleblower that we're all familiar with from Facebook, pointed this out, that Facebook was very aware of the harms that the surveillance advertising process was causing, but put profits over any care. The tragic cases at a human level are also amplified when we get to politics and when we get to news as well. And what we're calling for, and what we'd like the European Commission also to look at, is how do you ban surveillance advertising? It's not how do you ban advertising, but how do you ban surveillance advertising which channels people into ever-increasing echo chambers and which is distorting the way in which politics is evolving. Just one final thing before I hand over is that if you look at the Brazilian elections coming up at the end of this week, there are videos which are out on Facebook and on YouTube which are spreading mis and disinformation and which are not being taken down. As a result, 20% of Brazilians now are doubting the efficacy of electronic ballot boxes. That is a real practical danger to the future of our democracy. Okay. One final thing. I believe it's really important to support journalism and truth-based journalism. At Illuminate, we give grants to organizations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere to support strong, effective, investigative journalism which holds leaders to account. We need to continue to do this. I'm proud that we're also supporters of the International Fund for Public Interest Media, which Khadija, of course, will talk about as well.
That's a very good transition. Khadija, pick it up from there, please.
Thank you both. So, as you said, I'm from South Africa, and I'm a journalist. And I know there are a couple of journalists in the room, and I think you'll all agree that it is the best job in the world. For me, it really, really is. It is the best job in the world. And I want future generations of women from backgrounds like mine to be able to grow up and say they want to be a journalist, and for them not to be scoffed, for them not to face structural impediments to making that reality. The truth is, however, that the news media is becoming more and more embedded within elites, and it is becoming far out of the reach of normal people to be able to get in. And it's a problem particularly in places where I come from, in Johannesburg in South Africa. All my experience as a journalist is in Johannesburg in South Africa. I started off embracing the democratic potential of social media. I would not have actually been able to reach the quick successes within my career was it not for, ironically enough, social media. It was through Twitter that I was able to build a brand very quickly within this South African media space that allowed me to traverse the South African media landscape. That was only due to the democratizing potential of those platforms. But as my career progressed, and some years later, I found myself heading a newsroom. In between, I also launched my own news startup focused on young people, but eventually I ended up as the editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian in South Africa. So for those of you who don't know, the Mail and Guardian is one of Africa's most important, most iconic independent news publications. It was vital, actually, in ensuring the downfall of the apartheid state by documenting clearly all the crimes that that state did not want out. So it was, of course, a privilege to be leading that organization. And like I said, I love journalism. But it was perhaps the most dispiriting experience as well, being editor there. Not because the job wasn't great, not because journalism is no longer great, but what I found myself doing was basically managing round after round of layoffs at a time when news media, when factual information in South Africa was needed more than ever in our democratic history, at a time when the state was captured by former President Zuma's allies. And what I was dealing with was a rapidly shrinking newsroom in a context in which social media was also being weaponized against journalists and against truth. So I took the very difficult decision of leaving that newsroom. It was a very, very difficult decision. But I did it with the hope that we can find a structural solution to the problem, because it's not a uniquely South African problem. It is a global problem. The problem is that there no longer is a business model that can support news media. It is no longer business as usual. And it might sound alarming, but actually it is alarming. The truth is that thousands of journalists have lost their jobs. And it's not just about, me wanting a job, though that would be nice. But it is about our ability to understand each other, and that ability shrinking rapidly as we lose journalists. This morning, I think we learned a very powerful example of the media being able to build empathy for each other through the New York Times, the photo essay of ordinary people from Ukraine. And I think that is a very powerful, one of the most powerful examples of the media's ability and potential to build empathy. And with our resources shrinking in the newsroom as they are, in South Africa, as in Colombia, as in Brazil, as in Nigeria, as in the Philippines, as in India, we are losing our ability to build empathy with each other, to build understanding, above our ability as well to hold power to account. So what do? We need impetus. We need to take charge. And this is why I've joined this new organization. It's newish. We're about a year old now. It's called the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And what we are seeking to do is, first of all, we're trying to rebuild multilateralism. We recognize that multilateralism is deeply challenged, but we believe that the challenge facing us with news media, it is a challenge that intersects with every other challenge that we face as humanity. And we are calling on states, we're calling on corporate companies, whether they're technology companies or otherwise. We're calling on private philanthropy like those that Stephen represents. We're calling everybody to answer the call to put together financing for media to ensure the short and medium term survival of news media. And we can talk a little bit more about how that works, but
Great.
I think the others
Great.
need to
No,
talk as well.
Thank you, Khadija, because I think what you've rightly expressed is the complicated nature of social media. It both made your career possible, and it also drove you out of a job that you loved. And how you control something that has so much power to help and be good, but can also be manipulated, it's beyond our panel. But I must say it is one of the great challenges. And what you described about your newsroom is true all over regional newspapers, all over the world, particularly in the United States, where we can talk about this, but I mean, Facebook's eagerness to make money has done great damage to regional newspapers. And this is something I think Facebook sort of recognizes it's been dealing with, but not well enough. So now we're going to go to another editor, another former editor who's gone off to do maybe nicer things.
Yeah, I think I recognize what Khadija is saying. Being editor, and I've been an editor for more than 30 years, best job in the world. But the last 10 years have been about restructuring, trying to get more and more out of diminishing resource as we face the challenge of our traditional outlets decreasing and trying to capture the new markets digitally. So it's a tough gig. But anyway, I wanted to say that when we're talking about fake news, it's not new. It's the scale that's unprecedented. I think lies have been told for thousands of years, but I don't think they've ever been as sophisticated or as believable or as easy to spread. It's really frightening how quickly fake news gains traction and acceptance. And that's thanks largely to social media algorithms. We heard about that earlier. And often, I would say, an unquestioning audience that seem to be happy to be trapped in their own echo chambers. And of course, the other side of fake news, research has seen that you need to debunk it within about 30 minutes before it has traction. And of course, there are malign states and politicians using it for their own ends. I'll maybe share later some of the examples of things being twisted by leading politicians where my story has been told that they are categorically untrue.
Just tell one now, just because
I was involved in a little tweet dispute. I had a phone call when I was editor of one of my national titles saying that they'd seen the front page because we tweeted out, and it was categorically untrue, a pack of lies, no substance to it whatsoever. I will sue you, etc., etc. And I said, no, I stand by it, mainly because we had the documentary evidence to prove it. But still they tweeted out, don't believe a word we've printed. And of course it goes out to their acolytes, and they just retweet and retweet, and it does us damage. But I think we need to, as a society, wake up and recognize and understand just how big an issue fake news is and its impact on democracy and truth. I don't think that the public know the extent of misinformation and disinformation. We all do, and it's great that we're having this conference. But I don't think many of them know how and why fake news is generated and by whom. And worryingly, I don't know that a lot of them care. And I don't think they understand, many of them, the damaging influence of unregulated social media. And we need the public to help drive the change that's required. I kind of fear as a journalist for those who consume their news from echo chambers and don't have the tools or appetite to question, to debate, and critically understand the issues. I'd like to see us teach the pitfalls and benefits of social media in schools, and crucially, the importance of critical thinking, rational, skeptical, unbiased analysis or evaluation of factual evidence. That needs to be part of the curriculum. I'm glad to say there are thoughts about doing that, certainly in Scotland. Also, we need to restore trust in a responsible free press. I think at a time of the greatest threat to truth, healthy debate, and democracy, too many people are quick to undermine mainstream media. As I say, that example of the tweet. We need to cherish our credible news outlets, not diminish them.
Well, that's good news to hear for me. It's also, in a way, interesting because we have two former editors. Editors are crucial to judging truth. I mean, social media doesn't really have editors. People put out stuff. There's no one mediating, no one asking the question, is this true? Is it not true? How do you back it up? This is where I believe, perhaps hope against hope, that a press that can function, which has editors that ask questions, that challenge reporters' facts, their opinions, their biases, will survive. We'll see. Anna, what I want to do, say whatever you want to say, but I'm very curious in your sense of the struggle of your country, Ukraine. Is social media playing a positive role or a negative role? Is it being weaponized? What do you think?
I think social media is an enabler. So the good things, the bad things that exist in society, social media uses it and multiplies it. And I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. It basically is a platform or an opportunity to have something that's being done in the real world, offline, to be multiplied by million or by billion really, really quickly. I think the problem with social media, there are many, but one of the issues I've encountered while working as a journalist in Ukraine, while documenting human rights violations and war crimes and other abuses, is that social media enables us to create a reality where there is no truth. So previously, I would say there were fake news, there were honest pieces of information, verified information from so-called legacy media. Right now, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of state-sponsored propaganda, for example, from Russia, that doesn't necessarily aim to create fake news, but it aims to discredit truth as it is. So basically, the idea there is no such thing as objective truth. There are many different versions of different stories. Nothing is clear, so we can question everything. Nothing is real. And this is, I think, the big danger of social media, because while previously we could say this is true, this isn't true, now the majority of the people who are not social media experts, who may not have strong digital literacy skills, majority of those people will be just lost. They wouldn't be able to tell if something is true or fake, which means that it's very easy for truths to just be ignored or forgotten. I would say a big issue with social media is that it makes everything bigger. So we're not just talking about one fake or a shred of fakes, we're talking about narratives. It's a major battle of narratives. It's a normalization of colonialism. It's a normalization of hate speech, of a lot of things that would be unthinkable before because there was no platform to make those things so common. Now it's very easy to do that. As a journalist from Ukraine, a challenge, a problem, or an opportunity, however you look at it, that I encounter through my work, is that through social media, we get an enormous amount of data. There is so much data that we are using for our investigation to investigate war crimes, to investigate violations, to use as an evidence of hate speech, and so on. There's overwhelming evidence on social media. But what do we do with all of this data? This is a challenge a lot of Ukrainian and not only Ukrainian journalists are facing. How do we make sure that the data we verify, that we find open source investigations, how do we make sure that all of this information gets to bring justice? How do we make sure it can be used in courts? How do we make sure that all of this verified data is used beyond our publications? I would say a part of the solution could be a better cooperation between local and international, a better approach toward building networks between, let's say, big international media and organizations and local journalists on the ground, especially in conflict settings like Ukraine, but not only, where local journalists who have a very good background information, who are able to research where international journalists are not able to, are treated as equals, and where we have those partnerships between local and global, and where we can work together in some equitable form. And I hope to see that materialize. I already see that happening in Ukraine. We have successful or productive partnerships between different organizations. We have partnerships, for example, between legal NGOs and journalists, where different organizations basically share their expertise, where journalists even are training prosecutors on how to work digitally, how to verify information online. And I would like to see more of that materialize because this is crucial.
It's really interesting. I mean, this to me it's the first smartphone war. We didn't have that before. And as you say, it provides both evidence, but it also provides the opportunity for falsification, and it's overwhelming to some degree. I mean, we're reminded of, a guy I got to know named Peter Pomerantsev, who sort of wrote one of the first books. I mean, he didn't spend long working for Russian television, but it was long enough. And the book, I think the title was something like Everything is Possible and Nothing is True. And it's basically what you describe. It's just overwhelming every difficult, awkward fact with 12 different varieties of possibility to confuse people, to raise doubts. And so this is a question I actually want to ask you all. Let me jump in as you like, but it's the use of social media by states. And I don't necessarily just mean, Russia here. The United States uses social media. Everybody uses it. Ursula von der Leyen puts most of her announcements out on Twitter now, right? I mean, and I do wonder, when we talk about the problems of social media and we talk about regulation, we're talking about the same states that are manipulating social media as actually regulating it. And so I just wonder whether this issue strikes any of you, or it's just my own personal obsession. Anyone want to join in? Yes, Donald.
I think it is a major concern, their use or overuse of social media, because what it's actually doing is diminishing mainstream media. And what they're saying to people who are following them is that you don't need to turn to mainstream media, just turn to our outlets. The issue is, I think, in Scotland, I think they spend $9 million a year on spin doctors. There are more spin doctors employed by the Scottish government than there are specialist reporters covering health, education, and politics. And their job is to present the news in a fashion that the government wants. It's not necessarily about what's the truth.
I think it's important to understand why, for example, public servants or state representatives are on social media and what would be the objective of their messaging. I think it is normal and sometimes even useful to see those live streams where public servants answer questions from their voters and so on. As long as we understand why is this happening and there is a certain amount of transparency to the process, it's a different thing when it's being used basically to push certain false agenda or state propaganda. So I think it's about balance and just understanding what's done and why.
Do you think President Zelensky would have had the impact he's had without social media? What might have been different?
It's difficult to answer if questions. I think social media definitely facilitated his outreach to the world. It definitely enabled him to connect to a lot of people across the globe better, faster, in the language they understand also, because he was able to communicate with them directly. So it definitely provided him a better platform to reach people. I think in this case, it had a positive role. But then there are a lot of discreditation campaigns of him or of the state of Ukraine. So there's also a negative threat to that.
He was certainly quick to put on green during the war.
It's an interesting question because I think we are a couple of steps away from trusting regulation process, because I think what has to happen before perhaps is for a moment we need to gather states, we need to have them assert the fundamental nature of truth for society, first of all. The fundamental nature of information, the fact that information is a public good. The United Nations has time and time again tried to remind us of this. So I think that, we need to just take a few steps back, first get everyone to agree to that, and then find the mechanics of trying to make that happen. Politicians will always lie. Politicians are always going to, unfortunately, find ways to manipulate us. But what has to be a counterbalance to that is a strong, independent media that can actually be able to respond to that. And right now, some of the damage that we're seeing with disinformation, some of it is disinformation, some of it is actually just online manipulation through, as my Ukrainian colleague says, it's kind of narrative manipulation. It's happened in South Africa where racial tensions were amplified to a terrific extent that actually, is a whole panel in itself. Also, all done on Twitter. We're still reeling from those, right? But how was that exposed? It was the news media. It was journalists who did that. So we need to build countervailing forces to these things, knowing that social media is a force for good, it's a force for bad, but we have to put in some guardrails there. But in the meanwhile, I think what we have to ensure is that there is a strong news media ecosystem to be able to live within that.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think going back 10, 12 years, I was of that group of the sort of shiny-eyed Silicon Valley enthusiasts about the sort of, the potential for social media. You look back at Iran in 2009, you look at the Arab Spring, we talked very much about Twitter revolutions and Facebook revolutions. And there's no doubt that social media has that ability to connect and has the ability to amplify for very positive reasons as well. But I think what we're seeing now is the weaponization, and Ukraine is a good example. I think, to be honest, I think President Zelensky has won the social media war in English. And if you think about the followings he has within in the English language, there's no doubt that that is predominant, and any Russian propaganda is discredited. What we've got to be careful about is also Russian propaganda in other languages. In the Balkans, in Latin America, in Africa and Asia, the Russian narrative is predominant. And that partly contributes then to people's understanding, misunderstanding, and also at a government level of whether they will condemn the actions of Russia within the context of Ukraine as well.
I think you've put your finger on a very important point that I've often tried to investigate. It's not RT and Sputnik that's the problem. It's Sputnik in local languages. It's Russian sponsoring of small magazines that are online. that most of us don't read and don't actually notice or care about. And this is really a problem because it's cheap. It's very easy to do it. I was very struck just simply, part of war is symbolism. Part of it is horror. But the picture of, Zelensky in his T-shirt meeting people on the street compared to Vladimir Putin at the end of a 900-meter table was pretty dramatic. And I think, that sort of thing goes viral and makes a tremendous difference. I want to just come back to the issue, if you don't mind, of regulation, because this is, people talk about it all the time without really, I think, talking much about the complications of it. I mean, yes, in the beginning, these social media companies argued they were like utilities, right? I mean, they were just the highway over which these cars traveled, and they weren't responsible for the cars. They just provided the highway. It's like the electric company just provides electricity. What you do with your electricity, hey, that's all up to you. That's freedom. But that doesn't work anymore. And of course, we regulate electric companies and we regulate utilities. But can you actually, in a serious way, regulate something that has whatever Facebook has, 8 billion? I mean, it has half the world is somehow attached to Facebook, though I am not, I'm afraid. But I mean, how does a government actually begin to do this? Seriously.
I mean, it's a very difficult issue, and it's also a very dry issue as well. When you start to talk about, regulation, you can see people's eyes glaze over, and you've lost them already. I think what we've also got to be careful of is that regulation can also be used as a pretext for censorship. And we've seen this in many countries around the world, where on the whole issue of fake news. So governments have introduced fake news laws in order to protect their citizens, ostensibly, against misinformation and disinformation. But that's a thinly veiled attempt to censor. And so we have to be very careful about the way in which regulation is misused as well. I think, and where I will come back to the EU, is I think where you have regional bodies and regional legislations and regulatory frameworks, you have more opportunity to both set precedents within those 27 countries, but also for those laws and regulations to be adopted by other countries as well. And what you often find within the EU is that other countries will look to the EU for precedent, and then Brazil, India, Argentina, Mexico, or whatever, will then adopt those laws. So again, we could talk about this all night. My point, I think, is to, as I said earlier on, is to try and focus on the worst excesses of where surveillance advertising takes you down into capturing people's data, into echo chambers. It fuels polarization, it destroys democratic discourse. That's the area where we need to regulate. We don't need to break up Facebook and so on. You can't do that.
No, that's right. Because I'm also struck, I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on this. We've got about 5-6 minutes left. Because I also want to raise just the issue of autocratic control inside their own borders of what people know and hear and can actually get, right? I mean, I'm thinking obviously of China, which has basically its own internet, its own WeChat, its own Apple, its own Facebook, its own Amazon, and very carefully controls what people are able to see. Its propaganda to its own people is pretty sophisticated. I mean, you can talk to Chinese young people. You can offer them a VPN so they can go outside and understand the world. Some of them are not really very interested in it. So, I mean, there's that issue. And then you have the issue, let's say, of Russia, which so far has had very little internet censorship, but where propaganda works very, very well regardless, partly because of television, partly because of lots of things. And so I wonder, we talk nicely about Western world and how we regulate this, but what do we do about the power of controlled information in countries that don't accept our our values. Does it matter? Is there anything we can do? Is there anything Ukraine can do? I mean, when Russia takes over territory, the first thing it does is it changes the internet, it changes the phone, it changes the passport soon too, I'm afraid.
Well, I definitely think that this strategy, obviously, it aimed to brainwash a lot of people, and in some cases it did work, unfortunately. So obviously, we cannot underestimate the ability to access information, especially in critical situations. But as you said, just having access to truthful, unbiased, or transparent information doesn't always necessarily lead to action. So basically, transparent media or transparent information does not necessarily equalize democracy. And that's something that is definitely very upsetting, because if it was equal, then we would have a much easier time, just give people, transparent, honest media, and they'll be able to figure out for themselves. But it doesn't work that way. I think a lot of people do not think in terms of higher values such as freedom or access to information. They definitely use more of economic values for thinking. So basically how wealthy I am, how financially secure I am. As long as I get that maybe I don't need those other things. And I think it's kind of like this, what do we agree to give up in exchange of something else? And ideally, we wouldn't need to give up freedoms for economic security, but we definitely see that happening in a lot of autocracies. I think what is important is that we should not let technological companies off the hook so easily. So basically, a lot of companies like Facebook say, well, too much data, too many users, too difficult to monitor, which is ironic because they actually have more resources than a lot of governments. And they could definitely do more. What we are seeing actually with a lot of Twitter, Facebook moderation is that they often take off content that is in Ukrainian, that is truthful, simply because there are trolls, there are bots, there are reports that request Facebook to take it down, and then they also have imperfect algorithms, and the moderators do that. And it's tricky, and they need to do more, especially in languages other than English.
Exactly, and there is that power of nostalgia, which is incredibly powerful. John?
So you raise an interesting question about what can actually be done to combat misinformation within autocratic states, closed states like Russia and China. And the truth is very little we can do from outside, right? There's very little. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that the influence, and you've touched on this a little bit, of these states and their ability to actually influence media beyond their borders is expanding rapidly, especially in Africa and Latin America. I am from South Africa, where the Chinese state has shareholding in a large media group. Elsewhere in Africa, the Chinese Newswire provides free content. And in a time where newsrooms are not able to pay their bills, something like that is just a quick, easy solution to fill your newspapers to get it to print. Similarly, with Russia's doing similar things in different ways. I'm going to harp on about this, and I know people don't want to hear this, but what we have is a financial problem, and we need to begin by answering the financial crisis facing news media right now, or else we will not have a news media ecosystem in 5 years' time.
Okay, we are running out of time, so if either of you have something short to say, that'd be great.
Very quickly, given the billions that the likes of Meta make, I don't think we're asking for a lot to invest properly in journalism and for them to promote it.
Okay. Stephen, you're fine. All right, fine. So I keep thinking of, you've all heard it probably, this famous line of Mark Twain, that a lie is already halfway around the world before the truth puts on its trousers. So part of our problem is regulation, part of it is just human nature and the love of a good tale. But I do want to thank this wonderful panel. I've learned a lot, and join me in thanking them, and thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all. And most of all, thank you, everybody, for being here. This brings today to an end. Tomorrow we're meeting at the Academy of Athens, not Zapion. So please come 10 a.m., Academy of Athens. And tonight, this night is still young. I can hear music. Please wander around, taste some food in Plaka. It's been a very long day, so I don't think we need something else. So please walk around, taste Athens, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.